after Sir Michael Gambon passed away in late 2023. His longtime countryside residence in the Oxfordshire Cotswolds stood quiet for months, cloaked in fog and ivy like a fading stage set after the curtain falls. The home, an old 17th-century stone farmhouse nestled on the edge of Chipping Norton, had long been admired by neighbors. Gambon had kept to himself in his later years, rarely attending local events, but his presence loomed large both for his fame and the strange atmosphere that clung to the house like woodsmoke. In the spring of 2024, the house was finally listed for sale. There were no open houses, no promotional photos. The agents offered only one cryptic line: a private artist's retreat in need of love. It didn't deter Oliver and Helena Drayton, a London couple in their early 40s who had been dreaming of a quiet life for their two children, Iris, 11, and Sam, 8. Oliver was a sound engineer for television dramas. Helena, a former set decorator who had stepped back to homeschool the kids. They had money saved, a shared love for the arts, and an appreciation for the kind of atmosphere others might avoid. They moved in July just before the school year. The house was as peculiar inside as it was charming outside. Low timber beams, stone fireplaces, narrow staircases, and doors that didn't quite shut right. Gambon's belongings had been removed mostly, but there were lingering signs. A single velvet curtain left in the drawing room, an old brass ashtray bolted to the wall beside the fireplace, and a vintage radio that would occasionally hum with static, even when unplugged. The first few weeks were idyllic in that exhausting post-move sort of way. Boxes, paint samples, late-night wine by the fire. But strange things began happening almost immediately. First, it was easy to brush off. A cold draft in the hallway, creaking floorboards, the heavy scent of pipe tobacco drifting through rooms no one had entered. Then the children began waking at night, whispering about an old man who walks without shoes. Helena noticed it most in the mornings. Objects moved slightly, her teacup turned sideways on the counter. A scarf hung over a doorknob that she didn't remember touching. The antique mirror in the upstairs landing grew foggy with condensation even on dry days, as if someone had been breathing too close to the glass. Once, she found the piano lid open in the drawing room, despite locking it the night before. A single key middle C was depressed and humming quietly, though nothing touched it. Oliver remained skeptical until he had his own encounter. Working in the converted barn studio late one night, he heard footsteps outside. Heavy, deliberate. He stepped out, expecting a fox or maybe Sam wandering out of bed. But there was no one, just the shape of a tall figure at the window, faint and pale, with a slouch and something in the hand, a rolled-up script. Maybe? The figure was gone before Oliver could move. They tried to rationalize it. Grief echoing through the walls, their own imaginations stirred by moving into a house that once belonged to a man so deeply tied to theatrical illusion. But the events only escalated. Lights flickering at precisely 9:03 p.m. each night. Iris drawing faces she claimed weren't from dreams but from that room upstairs. Helena's phone recording strange audio files on its own, garbled and husky, like someone rehearsing lines underwater. They eventually brought in a medium not because they believed, but because they were desperate to understand. The woman, older and very quiet, spent an afternoon alone in the drawing room and emerged visibly shaken. She didn't name names, but she said something that Helena couldn't forget. He's not angry, but he doesn't know the show's over. The Draytons didn't move. In time, they adjusted. They learned to say good morning when entering the sitting room and to leave the velvet curtain exactly as it hung, even if it looked ridiculous next to their modern furniture. On some nights, they hear shuffling in the hallway and the soft click of a lighter Michael Gambon's ghost. It seems had been a creature of routine. His presence never harmed, but it refused to leave. Like a great actor trapped in the wings, waiting eternally for one final cue. October brought with it a heavy dampness that seemed to settle deep into the bones of the house. The limestone walls wept in the mornings, and Helena found herself lighting fires not for warmth, but to drive away the quiet dread that clung to the corners of the rooms. There was something theatrical in the air, like the moment before a curtain rises, the hush before something begins. She noticed it most in the drawing room. The room had once been Gambon's favorite, or so the estate agent mentioned. It had a deep-set hearth, blackened with soot that no amount of scrubbing could quite remove, and 3 mullioned windows that looked east across a field of mossy stones and the sagging fence of an old paddock. One wall had been lined with books gone now, save for a single volume left behind, a weathered collection of Beckett plays, spine cracked and frayed. Helena never opened it. Something about the way it leaned on the shelf slightly forward, as if listening unnerved her. It was in this room that the children stopped coming, without ever being told to stay away. Sam, always curious, now veered around its doorframe like it was a place of punishment. Iris, who was never easily scared, grew withdrawn whenever Helena entered the room alone. Once, when asked why she never came in anymore, Iris simply said, "Because he's still thinking." That phrase stuck in Helena's mind like a thorn. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe they'd overheard something. Maybe they were picking up on their parents' tension. But a deeper instinct, older, quieter, whispered otherwise. The same instinct that made her look over her shoulder every time she passed the old mirror on the landing. The same instinct that made her stop humming as she folded laundry upstairs, because sometimes something hummed back. One Thursday afternoon, shortly after 4, she heard the sound again, clearer than before. A voice, deep, not unkind, but disembodied. Just a phrase, muttered from the direction of the drawing-room fireplace. "Again. Let's try it again." The words were spoken with the kind of weariness that only actors and old men carry. Rehearsal. The eternal loop. Helena stood frozen, tea towel in one hand, a plate of half-dried china in the other. She listened, but nothing followed. No breath, no creak, just the sound of the wind clawing at the hedges outside. Oliver had grown quieter too. His disbelief had become a kind of dull concern. One night, while reviewing audio clips from his editing work, he noticed something strange in the background of a recording, a faint cough, rasping and deliberate. He assumed it had bled in from another track, but when he isolated the file, the cough remained. Not once, but twice. The second time there was a whisper. It didn't say anything fully audible, just the shape of breath near a word. Like a line half forgotten. He didn't tell Helena. Not because he didn't want to worry her, but because he was beginning to fear what might happen if they started naming things out loud. Like feeding stray cats. Or ghosts. It was around this time that the upstairs study revealed itself. They had avoided it since moving in, not deliberately, but something always got in the way. A broken key. A stuck door. Boxes stacked high in front of it. But one cold Saturday morning, while rearranging books in the hallway, Sam quietly opened the door. The room was perfectly still and almost untouched. A long desk sat under a narrow window, covered in a green velvet cloth, dust thick on its folds. There was a chair, a lamp, and above it, a framed black and white photograph of a young man on stage, mouth open mid-speech, arms raised in that tragic posture of finality. Hamlet, maybe, or Lear. Helena stood in the doorway and didn't enter. The air inside was denser than it should have been, still and expectant. She felt deeply that someone had left the room just moments before, and yet it was empty in the most absolute way. Empty like a theater after the house lights have come up and the audience has gone home. Still carrying the echo of what had just happened, but no one left to hear it. She whispered, "We're not here to replace you." The words spilled out without thought. She hadn't planned to say them, but as soon as she did, the atmosphere changed. Not warmer, no, but more watchful. Not malevolent, but alert, as if someone behind the scenes had just taken their place in the wings. Outside, October melted into November. Fog rolled down from the hills each morning, hugging the chimney tops and clinging to the hedgerows. The crows that nested in the skeletal tree near the old barn began to gather in greater numbers, sometimes screaming in unison at dusk. Iris had taken to drawing them on the back of her spelling worksheets, always clustered, always facing the house. One day, Helena found a piece of paper tucked under her daughter's pillow, a sketch of the drawing room. The fireplace was exaggerated, looming, the furniture distorted, and in the corner of the room stood a tall figure in a heavy overcoat, back turned, gazing at the unlit hearth. The detail that made her skin prickle, The hands. They were large and expressive, one lifted mid-gesture as though caught mid-soliloquy. And on the ring finger a single circle of dark ink, clearly meant to be a ring. She didn't ask where Iris had seen it. She didn't need to. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The days grew shorter, and by late November the sun barely crested the treetops before sinking back into fog. The house, old as it was, seemed to reject electric light. Bulbs dimmed faster than they should. Even candles flickered inconsistently, as if a breeze passed through rooms without opening a door. At night, the stone floors felt colder than the weather should allow, as if the chill came from beneath the house rather than outside of it. Helena began to notice the silence. Not just the ordinary kind, but a thick, full-bodied stillness. The kind that presses against your ears and makes your heart sound too loud in your chest. And with the silence came presence. On a particularly gray Wednesday afternoon, Helena stood in the upstairs hallway, sorting clean laundry on the banister. Sam was downstairs with Oliver, building something out of Lego on the carpet. Iris was in her room sketching. Helena folded a sweater, reached for the next piece, and paused. From the corner of her eye she saw movement, a slow, subtle shift like someone stepping back into shadow. The door to the old study was ajar again. She had closed it that morning. She remembered distinctly using her hip, her hands full of towels. She stared at it now. The edge of the door angled toward her. No sound of hinges. No breeze in the hallway. Just that quiet movement, barely perceptible, like something hesitant or curious. She took a few steps toward it, slowly, socks whispering against the worn floorboards. The smell was the first thing she noticed: dust, old paper, faint wood smoke, and something else. Faint pipe tobacco. Not like a fresh puff, but the ghost of one. Residual. As if someone had sat there often, years ago, filling the room with scent and thought. Inside, the desk remained untouched. The green velvet cover was still soft in spots where dust hadn't settled. But the photograph on the wall, Hamlet or Lear, had shifted. It now hung slightly askew, just enough to be noticed. She reached out to straighten it. The moment her fingers brushed the glass, a sound rose behind her, barely audible, but unmistakable. A breath. Close. Mail. It didn't come from a vent or window. It came from just behind her ear, where no one was standing. She turned sharply, heart hammering, but the room was as it was. Empty. Quiet. Except now the curtain had shifted. That same velvet curtain in the drawing room, yes. She could see it from the landing. It moved. Not fluttered. Moved. As if someone on the other side had just passed through. That night, she sat with Oliver at the kitchen table long after the kids had gone to bed. The fire in the hearth snapped and hissed behind them, and the old walls absorbed the warmth as slowly as they absorbed everything else. She told him everything. The breath, the study, the photograph. He didn't interrupt, didn't laugh, didn't offer explanations. He simply poured them both another glass of wine and stared into the dancing shadows. "I heard a voice again," he said quietly. "Last week. In the barn. I was recording room tone for a project, just ambient nothing, and I caught it. The mic wasn't even live. Just background take." "What did it say?" she asked. Oliver looked at her with a kind of fatigue she hadn't seen before, the lines under his eyes deeper now, the gray in his beard more visible. He reached for his phone and pulled up the file. He hit play. A long pause of static. Then, faint, and surrounded by rustling, a man's voice. "Give me the light." Just a sliver. It was barely above a whisper, but not muttered, not random. Controlled. Deliberate. Spoken like a man who knew the shape of a sentence. Like an actor. Helena leaned back, arms crossed, and stared at the screen as the clip ended. The fire crackled softly behind her, but the warmth didn't reach her skin. "Do you think he knows?" she asked after a long silence. "That he's—" Oliver shook his head. "I don't think it matters to him." In the weeks that followed, Iris grew quieter, less social, more inward. She had always been a thoughtful girl, imaginative but grounded. Now, she would sit in silence for long stretches, eyes focused on things just beyond reach. One night, Helena found her awake in bed, sketchpad in her lap, drawing with short, intense strokes. The paper was filled with overlapping shapes: arms, coats, faces half-formed. In one corner, the outline of a tall man, head tilted downward, hands outstretched as if addressing an audience that wasn't there. Helena sat on the edge of the bed and gently touched her daughter's shoulder. "Who is that?" she asked as carefully as she could. Iris looked down at the drawing and didn't answer right away. Then, almost in a whisper, she said, "He asked if I knew the lines. I didn't. So he left." Helena pressed her lips together, fingers curling into the duvet. She wanted to ask more, but something stopped her. A weight, a sense that prying too deeply would change something, shift it too far. Instead, she leaned down and kissed her daughter's forehead. "You're safe," she said quietly. But even as she spoke the words, she wasn't sure who she was saying them to. December settled in like a fogged mirror. The frost came each morning, laying thin sheets of ice over the paddock stones and curling ivy at the edges of the windows. Helena began to feel the house shift beneath her like an aging actor, aching in its joints, no longer able to pretend its silence meant peace. There was something restless now. The stillness had become charged. In the drawing room, the fireplace refused to take firewood easily. Logs would blacken but not burn. Matches would snuff themselves out the moment they neared the hearth. Oliver joked once that it was method haunting, as though the ghost refused to allow the stage to light before he was ready. The recordings continued. Oliver had taken to leaving a microphone on in the barn studio overnight, capturing 8-hour takes of what should have been silence. What he got instead was presence. Footsteps in gravel where there was no gravel. The unmistakable flick of a lighter. Breathing. Always the breathing controlled. Steady. Like someone pacing just behind a curtain. Once, there was a single word whispered clearly, in a tone that chilled Oliver to the core. Again. As if the performance had not ended. As if the final bow had never come. On the night of the winter solstice, everything changed. It was past midnight when Helena was woken by a sound, something between a creak and a breath. The room was still. Oliver slept beside her, but something pulled at her attention, like a string around her chest tugged forward and downward. She stood, barefoot, pulling her robe tight against her body as she stepped out into the corridor. The air was unusually warm, heavy. The hall lights flickered once and died. She didn't need them. The moonlight through the small upstairs window was almost unnaturally bright, pale and cold, casting shadows sharp enough to draw lines through the old wood grain. She moved down the hallway, slowly, deliberately. The door to the study was open, not ajar, open wide. Inside, the room had changed. The green velvet was gone. The desk, bare. The old photo of the actor tilted for weeks now hung perfectly centered, the glass gleaming. But what drew Helena's eyes was not the photograph or the window or even the thick scent of smoke curling around the ceiling. It was the figure in the chair, seated, still, facing the window. She did not scream. She did not run. There was no panic in her, only a weight, a sudden crashing understanding. The man in the chair was not solid, not entirely, but more defined than a shadow. He wore a heavy wool coat, shoulders broad, one hand curled slightly over the armrest, as though holding something. In the other, a piece of paper. A script? The page fluttered gently, though there was no breeze. He did not turn, but she heard his voice. Close, measured, steady. "I never finished it. The last scene." The lights came too early. She found herself nodding, lips parting slightly. "I think you did," she whispered. "I think everyone saw." Silence. Then he turned his head. Only slightly. Enough for her to see the edge of a cheek, a pale brow, eyes fixed somewhere far off into memory, perhaps. Into stage lights she couldn't see. "I stayed to be sure," he said. "You understand." And in that moment she did. The lines he spoke, the steps he repeated, the figures the children saw, the breath in the corridor, the flick of the lighter. He wasn't angry. He wasn't trapped. He was performing one last time, over and over, because he had been built that way. The stage was his sanctuary, and death had not dismissed the call. "You can rest now," Helena said gently. But he didn't respond. Instead, he rose. The figure stood slowly, as if the joints still remembered age, and turned fully toward her for the first time. The face was his, Michael Gambon, older but clear, and with that same expression he'd worn on stage so many times. Sadness cloaked in authority, depth in silence. He looked past her, through her, and whispered the last line. Exit pursued by nothing, and he walked out of the study, through the doorway, not brushing against her, not touching the world at all but passing like breath. By the time she turned, he was gone. The next morning, the children woke without complaint. The house felt lighter, as though it had exhaled. The rooms, though unchanged, seemed warmer in some imperceptible way. The drawing room curtain hung still. The velvet in the study was faded, unmoved. Oliver checked the barn mic later that day. The night's recording was empty. For the first time, total silence. No footsteps, no breath, not even ambient noise. Helena stood by the upstairs window that evening, watching crows gather on the distant tree. For weeks, they'd screamed and scattered like black arrows. Now they simply sat, quiet, watching the house as though it had finished telling its story. She felt something close in her chest, not grief, not fear, just curtain call. In the years that followed, the house remained theirs. Guests who visited often commented on the calm, on the strange, deep quiet. A few noticed the scent of tobacco lingering in the study, or the photo on the wall that always seemed a little brighter than the others. No one ever saw him again. But sometimes, on cold nights when the wind shifted just so, Helena would sit in the drawing room, close her eyes, and swear she heard footsteps on the old stage boards of the upstairs floor. Not trapped, just remembered, like a good line from a great play, spoken once more before the lights fade for good. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.